Looking specifically at this question, and what do we mean, and what's meant when people talk about students as consumers, I think the answer is twofold, really, and how we've managed to come here. I think it first started in earnest in the HE sector when student fees were introduced. And if students are going to be paying something, then there is a product that they're paying for and they're going to receive the product. And there's a supposed purchaser-producer relationship out of that. We can get into the rights and wrongs of that a bit later. I think that's where it started. And also, going back to the sort of 1980s, there has been a discourse in public services, in the public sector, about treating, so you don't talk about patients or travellers on transport services or pupils in schools. They're users, they're service users, they're customers. And that discourse has been around for a long time. And I think that has crept into the discussion about higher education as well. So that's a short answer to that first question.
In answer to the first question, what's meant when people talk about students as consumers, I think of three key areas. First of all, individuals who have already experienced university and were fully funded. So a number of our parents who, are probably feeling quite aggrieved at the fact that they're paying for their child to go to university when they previously went to university for free themselves. I think of students. I think of the wall of debt at the student union, where students are writing down how much it is that they're going to be in debt when they finish their university education. Again, with students, I think of student groups, such as Reclaim the Uni, who are trying to champion the student cause in terms of trying to eliminate tuition fees. And finally, I think of accountability. So all these movements and discussions that are taking place, and this increasing activity of students taking more active interest in their education, I think of the issue of accountability, in that we're now having to make universities accountable for the kind of education they're providing to students because they feel they're paying for a commodity, a product, like Derfel said.
Picking up, I suppose, on what Derfel was talking about in terms of sort of where it comes from, it is very much from when students started paying for fees, there was that shift. Up until that point, obviously, students had always been contributing towards their education. They'd been taking 3 years out of life, so sort of the postponing getting a paid employment. They were paying, contributing towards their costs of living and so on, as well as paying for their books, their field trips, and the other costs associated with it. But certainly when fees were introduced in 1998, there was that shift in perception amongst students that now that they were actually, there was a price tag attached to what they were going to study. In a sense, that shifted that. And when Lord Deering produced his report, which sort of paved the way for tuition fees in the first instance, even in that, he was sort of saying that it was likely that complaints from students would increase as a result of changing student expectations, but also the increased financial commitments, and we've seen that happening. So even when they were talking about charging students in the first instance, they knew that there was going to be an impact that happened as a result. Picking up on the Manchester survey, it's quite interesting that students themselves, some of them consider themselves consumers, some of them don't, some of them consider themselves as producers, and that's very much the model that I would prefer. But there are students that do consider themselves consumers and do actually try and use that for their benefit. And we've touched on sort of increased information. We've sort of touched on some various other dimensions in which they can use that to their advantage. But students are becoming a lot more demanding in what they do. Back when I went to university, I didn't have to pay tuition fees. So when a lecturer didn't turn up in the morning, I was actually sort of quite chuffed. I mean, it meant I could sort of go to the coffee shop or go to the student union or whatever. Nowadays, when a lecturer doesn't turn up, just down the road at Man Met, we hear about this texting service where students text the student union if their lecturer turns up 10 minutes late. So actually, sort of pushing that hand into that power into the hands of sort of the consumers has been sort of quite an interesting byproduct of what's happened by charging students the fees. We've seen that exacerbated even more when students have been charging more fees when sort of top-up fees were introduced. But I suppose the key point about that was not necessarily the increase in the fees, but the market principle behind it. It hasn't necessarily come into play as much yet, but the fact that different universities are able to charge different amounts, but also different courses are able to charge different amounts. So if at some point the cap is lifted or comes off, you'll then much more easily be able to compare. I'm paying £3,000 to go to this university, whereas I had to pay £7,000 to go to that university, or this amount to go to study that course, that compared to that. So students would become increasingly, I suppose, sensitive to the price of that. And what was actually quite interesting, and you, Paul mentioned Lord Mandelson in his framework for higher education that he launched earlier this week. He sort of talked about sort of students as sort of the most important clients of higher education, that fees have sharpened attitudes to value for money. But actually what was interesting, David Willetts, the opposition Secretary of State at the Conservative Party conference, was talking about be careful what you wish for. If that cap is lifted or is taken off completely, what impact will that have on the way in which students look at higher education?